Section 29 of Angelica by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Krista Zaleski. Chapter 13. 1. Angelica was working in the back parlor the next afternoon when Cillin and Devery brought her in a letter. She smiled ironically and tucked it into her blouse, for she knew the writing. "I wonder how he'll be this time," she reflected. "You can never tell. Maybe in an awful rage, or sad, or making love. Well, it doesn't matter to me now. I've finished with him. But I was really nearly gone last night." She had stopped short in her work and sat looking vacantly before her. "I don't know why I'm such a fool about that man. I don't know what it is about him." 2. She didn't trouble to open his letter until she was ready to go home. Then, alone for a minute, she pulled it out and opened it half sadly. "No," she cried suddenly. "No, I don't believe it." "What is it?" Devery called out from the next room. "Nothing," said Angelica with stiff lips. She hid the letter in her blouse in terror at the idea of its being seen. Then she was forced to bring it out again, to read it, to make sure. "Wanton, without a heart, you thing from the gutter, willing to give your body to any man, while you keep your cold and poisonous heart to yourself for your own sordid aims. I swear to you I will never let you destroy Eddie as you have me. It would be an outrage to call you sister, to permit you to bear our name. I would rather die, and I shall die. I have enlisted in the army. I shall soon be sent to France, and I shall find Eddie there and tell him your little history. Then I shall die. Nothing on earth can stop me. It will be the supreme moment of my life when I tell Eddie, when I see his face and know that your shameless ends are frustrated, when I know that you are really ruined." "He won't do it," she tried to reassure herself. "He's always making threats. He wouldn't really do anything that might harm himself." But she knew that Vincent didn't always act from self-interest. His passions were very apt to overwhelm him, and malice was one of the strongest of his passions. He would enjoy exquisitely telling the rich a tale to Eddie. For 3 months she didn't draw a freed breath. She tried to dismiss her terror from her mind. She said to herself resolutely, "Don't borrow trouble. Don't worry about what may never happen. Don't cross your bridges before you come to them," and all sorts of tags from her mother's store. She faced Devery and Cillin every morning with the same hearty good humor. She was dutiful and severe at home, as had become her custom, and to no living soul did she give the smallest hint of what she was enduring. Every time a letter came from Eddie, or if a mail were missed, she expected the blow to fall. All her laboriously made plans to be destroyed, her pride and dignity trampled underfoot, all her life wrecked. She was utterly in the dark. She had no idea what was going on, or what had already happened, and she could take no steps to gain information. She could do nothing but wait. Then came another letter from Vincent. "I am home on leave. That means we shall very soon be going over. Goodbye, Angelica. I have a hard, bitterly hard task before me. I must hurt Eddie, and I must hurt you. As for me, there is nothing before me but death. Deserted and ruined as I am, I long for death. Your love was all that pleased me in life. With that gone, there is nothing but a waste, bleak beyond endurance. I shall only beg Eddie to forgive my vile treachery, as I beg you to forgive my sins against you. Forget your presumptuous and wicked dream of marrying that good man. That can never be. He will forgive you, as he will forgive me. But he will never forget. Goodbye, Angelica. I give you to God. Vincent." Asleep and awake, that picture haunted her. A vision of Eddie, mud-stained, horribly pale, sitting on a box, with a candle flickering on the ground beside him, in a dugout with mud walls and great puddles of filthy water, the sort of thing she had seen in the cinema, ghastly, desolate, with an incessant play of rockets and bursting shells overhead. And Vincent standing before him in one of his fine attitudes, so handsome, so strong, so noble, telling him. She knew how he would dwell upon the details, with what color he would describe her caresses, her kisses, heightening the temptation just as he would heighten his remorse. It didn't occur to her that Vincent might encounter some obstacles to a prompt meeting with his brother, with all the different services and all the vast battlefield to be considered. She fancied him being at once directed to Eddie's dugout like a stranger in a village. She lived in a long nightmare. She didn't know how the blow would fall, whether she would come home to find a letter from Eddie casting her off, whether Mrs. Russell would be there to tell her, whether she would have a letter from some stranger, a friend of Eddie's, A lawyer, perhaps. But what she most feared was the idea of coming to Fine Feathers some morning and seeing Cillin and Devery suddenly turned hostile. She felt that she could not bear that. It would do for her. But weeks went by and nothing at all happened. One day, while she was in the back parlor, she heard Mrs. Russell's voice in the front room, but the very tone of it reassured her. She wanted to buy a hat, and she wanted Angelica to let her have it cheap, so she was extraordinarily agreeable. She had, moreover, some sort of idea that it would help Angelica in the eyes of her partners to be seen in friendly converse with a lady like herself. "I wish you'd come and see me," she said. "I'm so lonely. They've all gone. Vincent, you know, and now poor Cortland's been drafted. Dear me, it does seem as if they ought to be able to make up a big enough army out of those who want to fight, without dragging in the unwilling ones. Poor Cortland will make a very bad soldier. He hates it so. He's too independent. Vincent was really marvelous, if you could have seen him in his uniform. And he told me to be sure, if I saw you, to tell you not to forget him. He even went to Polly and begged her to be reconciled to him before he left, perhaps never to return. I went to see her too, to see if I could influence her. But what do you think? She's adopted a baby, and she's wrapped up in it. She says it fills her life and she doesn't want anyone else. She's very hard on Vincent. Those frightfully maternal women are always dreadfully hard on men, don't you think? I'm not surprised at her adopting a child. She was so absorbed in the one she lost. I couldn't do a thing with her. She said she had done with Vincent, poor boy. She's narrow, provincial, awfully selfish, don't you think? I don't know, said Angelica. I suppose she can't help how she feels. Well, I thought it was horrible to see her there. So happy with that baby, so callous about her husband. Not even her own baby, some little waif she's picked up. It's a wretched, puny little thing, too. She has to give it the most unceasing care. I shouldn't be surprised to hear any day that she's lost it. Oh, my dear, what's that heavenly mass of purple? That's a negligee I'm making, said Devery, thus addressed. Could I possibly wear purple? Inquired Mrs. Russell earnestly. Do please let me see it. Oh, how marvelous! Could I possibly slip it on? Am I hideous? She asked Angelica anxiously, when she had got the purple garment on and stood before the long mirror. It's not quite your style, said Angelica with great seriousness. I think, but Miss Devery will give you suggestions. A dark green, said Devery, with dull blackish blue overtones. And not a floating thing like this, Mrs. Russell. You're slender enough to stand a straight, narrow garment. Not exactly a negligee. I never advise them. There's so little use in them. But what I call a boudoir gown. How much would it cost? Asked Mrs. Russell. $100, said Devery. Mrs. Russell looked at her, then at Angelica. They both had their professional manners, polite, deeply interested, but firm. There was no mercy to be had from them. She ordered the gown, then she bought a sports hat of Angelica for a staggering sum, and prepared to take her leave. But now Miss Cillin came in, pleasant and businesslike. I'd be very pleased to make you a 10% discount, madam, she said, or for anyone personally introduced by our Miss Kennedy. Oh, Cillin, said Angelica when she had gone, wasn't that nice of you? You can't imagine how anything like that pleases her. Angelique, my child, we'd do more than that for you, said Cillin. 3. Telephone, Mademoiselle Angelique, cried Devery. Would you mind asking who? I've just got this thing pinned. It's Mrs. Geraldine, Devery called. Can't you come? Angelica's heart stood still. This is it, she thought. Now it's come. She went with leaden feet to the telephone in the back room and sat down before it. She stared at the instrument for an instant in horror. What was it about to reveal? She took up the receiver. Yes, she said. Is that you, Mrs. Geraldine? Can you come to see me? Said that well-known voice. There's something. Why, she cried. What is it? Is anything wrong? The baby's quite well, but there's a piece of news you ought to know. Oh, she gasped. Oh, tell me. What? Don't lose your head, Angelica, but come when you can. I'll be in all the afternoon. And don't worry, it's only that I think you ought to know before all the others. She didn't wait to hear the rest. She left the telephone and turned to her friends, a distracted and blanched face. I've got to go, she said. Is anything wrong? Asked Cillin kindly, alarmed by her look. Yes, I've got to go. Can't I go with you? No, no, no. Angelica was pinning on her hat, without even a glance in the mirror, and was starting out when Devery stopped her. Your bag, she said, or are you coming back today? Never, she cried. Never. They stood together watching her go. "Poor kid," said Devery. "It must be something very wrong." Angelica was out of sight, hurrying along the street, trembling with eagerness to embrace this anguish, to get it over, to be done with her torment. She rang Polly's bell, and Polly herself admitted her visitor. She looked ill and haggard, with eyes heavy and dull, and reddened with sleeplessness. Or was it with tears? "Come in," she said pleasantly. "Sit down, Angelica. Will you have a cup of tea?" "Oh, no," she cried. "Hurry up and tell me. They all know it. Eddie's written." "Oh, Mrs. Geraldine, I knew right away. Eddie's written to say that Vincent's told him. Oh, my God. He said he would, and he has. That's what he went for. Oh, my God, all my life ruined. Oh, Mrs. Geraldine." "My dear, try to calm yourself," said Polly. "There, sit down. You're making yourself ill. Vincent hasn't told anyone. He never will, Angelica." "He said he would." "He never will. He's dead." Her voice broke in a faint sob. "Dead!" cried Angelica. "Vincent? In the war?" "The transport he was on struck a mine." "Then he never got there. He never told Eddie." "No." "Oh, Mrs. Geraldine," she cried, "then I'm safe." Polly turned away. "Don't you feel sorry?" she asked. "He was very young to die." Angelica shook her head. "No, I can't," she said. "Not just now. I can't feel anything but glad." 4. She stopped on her way home to tell Cillin and Devery that it was all right. She let them know, modestly, that there was a certain person now in France in whom she was profoundly interested, and that she had feared some bad news in regard to him. Then she went to a quiet little restaurant and ate a delicious little dinner all alone, and in the chilly, cloudy evening walked home, a long walk. She was enjoying a feeling of exquisite and complete triumph. She had won. She was safe now, her troubles over. Certainly God had helped her. She was young, beautiful, beloved. She was about to be rich. She had made a gallant fight against great odds, and she had conquered. She greeted her mother with unusual affection, and was willing to talk with her for quite a time about her business, about the shortcomings of the tenants, about everything in the world except what had happened. That she didn't mention. She began slowly to undress while her mother was still in the kitchen, ironing a collar for her to wear the next day. She looked at herself in the mirror, in her dainty camisole. A beautiful woman with her delicate bare arms, her slender shoulders, her curious glowing black eyes, and her pale and lovely face. And suddenly, almost as if she saw it in the glass beside her own, another face, fierce, hawk-like, rigid and white, with bright hair spread out and floating as if in the sea. Her dead lover. End of section 29. Section 30 of Angelica by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Krista Zaleski. Chapter 14. The parlor now rejoiced in a new and pretty little set, put in there only the week before in order to receive the visits of Eddie. On one of the chairs sat Mrs. Kennedy, dressed in silk, her hair skillfully fluffed by her daughter, her hands manicured, her feet in soft new boots. She was well aware that she had never looked so common, so perfectly the janitress and scrub-woman. Her strained, haggard face, her faded eyes, her blunted and withered hands belied her fine attire. They could have belonged only to a woman who had worked brutally and hopelessly. She was years younger than Mrs. Russell, but she might have passed for her mother. Her patient hands were folded in her silken lap. She had nothing to do and very little to think about. The blasphemous triumph was accomplished. She was about to see sin crowned and rewarded, innocence betrayed and abandoned. In other words, Angelica married to Eddie. She was disgusted with life, thoroughly disappointed with her God. She took no pleasure in these preparations or in any of the comforts and enjoyments before her. Nothing sustained her but a vague sort of hope that her just God would retrieve himself by stopping this wedding in some way, with thunderbolts or the flaming swords of archangels, and she was well aware that one couldn't really count upon anything of that sort. Out in the kitchen she could hear the servant, she, the charwoman, servant of servants, sitting in the parlor while another woman drudged for her. In half an hour an automobile was coming to take them to the church, and then they were going off to Buena Vista, going to leave all this poverty and humiliation behind forever. She had been given to understand that she wasn't to live with her child, only to visit until a suitable home could be found for her. She was to have an apartment and a servant all of her own. She was to furnish the place as she wished, and she was to be provided with a new wardrobe. And start a new life, Angelica told her. "I'll need to," said Mrs. Kennedy. "This one is about done." And although a great deal of this was paid for by Angie herself, out of the money she had saved, her mother had never expressed gratitude. She didn't feel any. She had never at any moment of her life been so utterly dissatisfied. She glanced at the new clock. "Angie," she called, "what are you doing?" "Dressing," called back a too gay voice. "He'll be here in half an hour." "I'll be ready." 2. She was standing before the mirror in the bedroom, adjusting her hat, very delicately touching her hair under its net, tilting her head from side to side, frowning thoughtfully, trying to foresee the effect she would produce upon Cillin and Devery, Mrs. Russell and Polly, who would be in the church. She pictured herself and Eddie walking up the aisle. Eddie still in uniform, tall, severe, impressive, and beside him his beautiful young bride. She was wearing a plain dark brown broadcloth suit, a big black hat, and a magnificent set of silver fox furs Eddie had given her. She looked like a princess. They couldn't, any of them, find a flaw in her appearance or in her bearing. None of those born ladies could approach her. She looked what she was determined to actually be, the equal of any one of them. There was a position ready for her, and she was competent to fill it. Eddie had been so delighted with the change in her. She hadn't seen much of him since his return at the end of the war, but all his hours with her had been a perpetual service of praise. He had hurried to her his first free minute. He had wanted to give her anything, everything, extravagantly and ridiculously. He had been tactful and kindly with the rather contemptuous Mrs. Kennedy. He had been to see Devery and Cillin and had won their hearts. He had been quite perfect. And all these thoughts were merely flitting across her mind like birds flying above a frozen pond. Under the ice were horrors beyond naming. She did her utmost to ignore them, to think of those things as dead and buried and forever gone from her world. But she could not. All that night she had been dreaming of her drowned lover, floating horribly in the sea, and with him, directly beside him, her baby. Their baby. Its little body extended like his, tiny white face upturned. And she and Eddie sat on the deck of a ship, she facing these two corpses which came smoothly along behind them, and she was using all her wit, all her charm, to keep Eddie from turning his head and seeing them. The dream haunted her and mingled with her wretched thoughts. For now that she was within a stone's throw of her goal, now that the cup was in her hand, to be raised to her lips, she was filled with a desperate impatience, a terrible fever of haste and fear. Her hands were burning, her knees weak and trembling. "Oh, just this one more hour," she murmured. "If only nothing will happen." She looked past the moment to the heaven of happy years beyond, as a man sailing a perilous channel might look ahead to the wide and quiet sea beyond. Something will happen, she told herself. At the last minute, someone will tell him, scream it out in the church, stop the wedding. Oh, God, just help me now. Let me get safely married to Eddie, and I'll try my best to be good. She was conscious of being a little too pallid, too worn, and she rubbed on her smooth cheeks a little rouge. It looked horrible, and she wiped it off frantically. No, it must be my eyes that look so queer. I wonder if Eddie'll notice and think I look queer. It might make him suspicious. She forced herself to smile. Of course I'm nervous, she said. Everyone is. It's nothing. Nothing at all. She suppressed a scream when the doorbell rang. She listened behind her half-closed door until she heard Eddie's voice talking quite in his usual tone to her mother. No one called her. Nothing had happened. She stood still in a sort of daze, getting no further forward in her dressing until her mother entered the room. "He's going to take me down and put me in the auto," said Mrs. Kennedy. "Then he's coming back after you. You'd better hurry. It's late, and I don't see any use for you keeping all those people waiting. That's not a very good way to begin." "All right," said her daughter hurriedly. "Go on, Mother." She set to work in haste to add the finishing touches to her dress, fastening the little bar pin with diamonds given her by Mrs. Russell, drawing on her white kid gloves. She heard him coming. She heard him stop at the kitchen door and tell the woman working in the kitchen that she might go. Then he came and knocked at her door. "Ready, Angelica?" he called out. She gave one glance in the mirror. Then she opened the door with a forced, polite smile. There stood the poor soldier who wished to give her all he had. Poor ardent Eddie, longing so to take her back to his beloved home and give it into her keeping. He stood in the doorway of her little room looking at her, and he too was smiling, a smile as strained and artificial as her own. "Angelica," he said softly. He had grown quite pallid, as he did when deeply moved, and his hands clenched and unclenched nervously. His face, his expression had changed. He was struggling his utmost to look and to be tender and respectful, but his heart was beating with an emotion neither tender nor respectful. He wiped his damp forehead and came a step nearer, always smiling, but with eyes strangely brilliant and fixed. "No," said Angelica sharply. She knew how he felt. She knew too well how he felt. It sickened and shamed her. "My darling girl," said Eddie, "my Angelica." "Don't," she said. "Don't say that. I'm not. But you will be very soon. We ought to go, Eddie. It's late." "Then kiss me, just once." She shook her head with a ghastly affectation of coquetry. "No," she said. "You'll have to wait." "Just as you like, Angelica," said the poor fellow. "You know, don't you, dear girl, that my chief wish in life is to make you happy? I wouldn't for— Then do come on, or I'll think you don't want to marry me at all." He turned instantly, and she followed him. Just to the door of the room, but no further. He looked back. "Aren't you ready?" he asked. "Eddie," she cried in a high, dreadful voice. "Eddie, I can't do it." "Can't do what?" he asked, startled. "I can't do it. I can't marry you. Not unless I tell you." He stared at her for an instant, his quick and clear mind at work upon this. "What is there to tell me?" he asked. "Let's have it." He was alert and suspicious now. "Come on, let's have it," he repeated. "Eddie," she began, but a great horror at her own folly assailed her. She felt impelled toward this abyss, while she struggled madly to turn aside, aghast at the destruction before her. Perhaps even now it wasn't too late. Perhaps she could disarm the suspicions she had aroused, could stop, and not tell him any more. Thank God it wasn't too late. She hadn't told him. She felt like a person cutting his own throat. The knife had only pricked. He is still alive, and in a mad exultation of thankfulness. She smiled. I got engaged to another fellow," she said. "But it's all over now." "When? Who was it?" "Last year." "Who was it, I say?" "He was a factory superintendent," said Angelica. "But it's all over now. I'm awfully, awfully sorry, Eddie." "You mean you engaged yourself to this fellow while I was in France? After you'd promised to marry me? I know it was wrong. But I hope you'll forgive me, Eddie." "Yes," he said, "I forgive you, Angelica. But, oh, how could you? I'm so disappointed in you. It was so dishonorable. It was low." I know," she cried with uncontrollable impatience. "But forgive me and forget all about it. I'm so sorry. What more can I say?" Did you let him kiss you?" "Yes," she murmured. "Angelica." "Oh, but I'm sorry," she cried desperately. Eddie stood looking at the floor for an instant. Then, with fierce suddenness, he caught her by the arm and pulled her forward so that he could look into her face. "Look here," he shouted. "How far did this thing go?" "It was nothing," she cried. "You said he kissed you. You said you were engaged to him. Some coarse, common brute of a workman mauling you. I know those people. I know their love-making. God, Angelica, you make me sick. You've no fineness, no decency," he cried. He searched her face with eyes that terrified her. "I don't believe you," he said suddenly. "But Eddie," she stammered. "I don't believe you," he said again. "You're lying. This fellow was your lover." "Oh, don't," she cried. "Answer me. Tell me the truth." "No, I did. I did tell you the truth. There was nothing like that." "Swear it. Say, 'I swear to God I was absolutely faithful to you all the time you were away.'" His eyes never left her face, but she repeated firmly, "I swear to God I was absolutely faithful to you all the time you were away." He looked puzzled. He sat down heavily in a chair and covered his eyes with his hand. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to be so rough. Only, it's a terrible disappointment to me, Angelica. I never imagined such a thing. I almost wish you hadn't told me. I keep seeing you and some hulking fellow in overalls." She was sobbing bitterly, standing before him like a forlorn and penitent child. "Don't cry," he said more kindly. "Don't cry, my dear. I'll try to forget it. I'll try. Will it not make any difference? She sobbed. I'll try not to let it. Only, Angelica, it was often so hard over there so hard to be true to you. Not even to think of anyone else. And when I think of it and how I hated myself even for my thoughts, I feel like a fool. I don't believe you'd have cared what I did. You don't feel as I do. You don't value loyalty as I do. She seized this opening. No, she cried. I shouldn't have cared one bit whatever you did, if only we love each other now. No, don't. I don't like to hear you say that. I want you to care as I do. I want you to be fine and high-minded. Eddie, I'm not. There's no use pretending that I am. I don't want you to pretend to be. I want you to try to be. I will. He was silent for a time. Now then, he said, it won't do to keep them all waiting any longer. Are you quite ready? Do you mean for us to get married just the same? Of course, he said. I couldn't be such a prig. I've simply got to forget what you've told me, and thank heaven that I've got you after all. You might have married the fellow. He was his own kind self again, but she could see that his great pride in her, his great joy, were gone. Come, he said again, we shall be very late. But she prevented him from leaving. She caught him by the arm and stood before him, looking up into his face. Eddie, she cried, with a gasp that seemed to tear her heart out. I've got to. I can't deceive you. Oh, God, it's so awful. He didn't move or speak. Eddie, she said, it was that. Ah, it was, he said in a tone of polite surprise. I had a baby. A shudder ran through him, and he closed his eyes in mortal pain. You can't ever know what I suffered. Oh, Eddie, Eddie, I've been punished enough for what I did. And the poor little baby. Never mind, he said in a voice so low that she could hardly hear him. Don't tell me any more. I don't want to know. He undid her fingers from his arm. I want to get away, he said. Goodbye. But she stopped him again. And the man was Vincent, she screamed. Now you know. End of section 30. Section 31 of Angelica by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Krista Zaleski. Chapter 15. The next morning, just at the usual hour, Angelica entered the back parlor, where Cillin and Devery were working side by side. They both looked up in a sort of stern surprise and waited for her to speak first. She stood before them, a quivering smile on her lips. She seemed on the verge of tears, but after a silent moment she raised her eyes to look at them with a sublime and touching bravery. "Can I come back?" she asked. They were both speechless. "I don't want to explain," she said in a trembling voice, "not ever. But if I can come back, I'll go on just the same." Miss Cillin got up. "Certainly," she said pleasantly. "If you like, we'll go on. In the old way. We'll forget all this. Don't you think so, Devery?" "Of course," said Devery. But no matter how they tried, their cordiality was strained, their looks averted. They knew, all three of them, that it would be a long time before this thing could be forgotten. Half of the letters of Angelique had gone from the windows, and how much more had gone as well. But at least their friendship had endured. They neither questioned her nor blamed her. They simply took her back, as wholeheartedly as was possible to them. Whatever incredible and discreditable occurrence may have interrupted the dazzling wedding, they would not repudiate her. She went to her cupboard, took out the box in which she had kept her odds and ends, and, sitting down at her old table, spread out the glittering gay scraps before her. "I'm going to stick to business now," she said, with a sob. End of section 31. End of Angelica by Elisabeth Sanxay Holding.